Fino.
Okay.
I'd like to begin with a story about a colleague of mine who was at a football game recently. It was a Friday night game, and it was a playoff. It was a big game, and so my colleague arrived early to kind of get a place in the stadium, and he quickly ran into three gentlemen whom he'd known for a very long time, all men in their mid-50s. And they were very excitedly talking, and one of them was talking about how he had just gotten back from Arizona. He was a dentist, and he'd gone to Arizona to scout out some real estate, because he and his wife were thinking of buying a second home there, opening up a second dental practice, so that they could spend their cold Midwest winters in Tucson, Arizona, rather than in the Midwest. He was going to keep his Midwest practice going, so this was not slowing down, but this was just a way for him to start spending his time a little bit differently. He was very excited about that. The second gentleman was the owner of a family insurance company that had been around for 100 years. And he was looking at succession planning. He was looking at passing the business along to his sons, because he was more interested at this point in his career of moving to Las Vegas and opening up a golf club. So he was very excited about that. And the third gentleman was a retired mutual fund company executive, already retired from his formal profession, but he was doing philanthropic and missionary work for his church and was very enthusiastic about what he was doing. So here are these three gentlemen in their mid-50s having that conversation at a point when their parents before them might have been talking about slowing down. Gary, my colleague, walked away from his conversation with these three men with the kind of thought in his mind that among them, they probably controlled about $30 million of personal assets. And as he walked away from that conversation, the one thought in his mind was, who's going to get that money? Which financial advisor, who among you is best poised to take advantage of their money at that particular point in their lives? And we would submit to you that the answer to that question is that the financial advisor that is best suited to help them find their retirement is the one that's going to be the one to help them fund it. Because they're looking at things as baby boomers do in an entirely different way than generations prior have looked at it. They're looking at this as a chance for a new beginning, to do something differently, a chance at a second career, at a new avocation perhaps, all different ways of looking at it, but they're looking at ways to find something new. And this is a shift, because the industry has looked at things historically differently. The industry tends to look at things with this in mind. How can we help retirees and pre-retirees fund their retirement? How can we help them build up the biggest pile of money as we possibly can? And this is a shift now because of the mentality of today's retirees and pre-retirees. So, with that in mind, in our time today, we've got a three-part agenda. We're going to first look quickly backwards at what retire meant. What does the old view look like? What is the more traditional view? We'll just quickly look at that. Then we're going to define what we mean by the new retire mentality. And then finally, we're going to spend the majority of our time on some very specific tactics and tools that you can use to change the conversation that you're having with these folks. So beginning with what retirement. I'm going to ask for your help here right away. I'm going to ask you to participate in a quick word association game. So when I say these two words, I'd like for you to turn to a partner and have your partner and you exchange what immediately comes to mind. So my words for you are traditional retirement. Go. Traditional retirement. What are some of the things that came up? Scratching at your crotch, sir, in the background is what it came to mind immediately. I can tell anything. What else?
Boating.
Boating, right?
Golfing.
Golfing.
Skiing.
Right? Ski, all kinds. So these are some pretty traditional ideas. A lot of times we'll hear things like sitting on the porch, or sitting in a rocking chair, or maybe going to dinner early, before anybody else eats. Things like that. Those are the types of things that we hear. And I think that intuitively, I'm wondering if any of you see your personal retirements looking that way. Do you see yourself spending a long period of time in a rocking chair, or going to dinner at 3:30 in the afternoon, or those kinds of things? typically not. And the reason that it doesn't is because intuitively we know that those aren't satisfying activities, and that those are in fact some ideas that have been maybe historically more relevant, but are changing now. The traditional idea of retirement, though, that older view, is often associated with one particular symbol. And what we often hear from people is that that symbol is a gold watch. You know, that you've put in your time, you've worked for 25, 30 or more years at one company, and then when you leave, you're given this symbol, this thanks for all of your years of service. And when you think about the image of a watch, it's kind of a depressing thought, you know, sort of a suggestion, maybe subtly or not intended, but still a suggestion that you only have a limited number of minutes left. You only have a limited amount of time left, and so here's a tool for you to keep track of that. And we think that that is an antiquated notion as well, and that perhaps a better symbol, a more representative symbol of the new retirement mentality is this, which is a compass, something that's helping you to find new direction, to find your way to whatever is next for you. The old idea, though, the more traditional idea of retirement has roots with this gentleman here. Does anyone know who this is? This is actually a chance where you can joke that it's somebody's father. Like this is actually Gary DeMoss's father.
The founder of Fedora Bank.
The founder of Fedora Bank, or the president, the most senior person in the room's father.
Freddie Fedora.
Freddie Fedora, yeah. This kind of, it usually gets all that. This is in fact Otto von Bismarck, who was the vice chancellor of the German Empire in the late 1800s. And this gentleman, Otto von Bismarck, is credited with establishing the contemporary notion of retirement. He did it first in Germany as a way of moving aging German bureaucrats through the ranks. And so he set up this system for retirement in Germany, but it really started to take hold in the United States a little bit later on. In the early 1900s, the first company to establish a formal pension plan was American Express. And then a little bit later, in the depths of the Great Depression, FDR, the president and his cabinet, the New Dealers, had a big problem on their hands. They had people rioting in the streets in the U.S. They had 25% of the labor force unemployed. They literally had chaos, and they had to do something. So they followed the only example that they had, which was the example set by Otto von Bismarck. And they figured, no, it'll work for Germany, it'll work for us, and so they followed his plan. And here we were then in 1935 in the U.S., where we had a retirement age that was set just like von Bismarck said it at 65 years old. But does anyone know the lifespan in 1935? Yes, sir, you're absolutely right. It was 63 years old, so we had a generous retirement plan of -2 years in 1935. That was the intent of this particular precedent. And so here we are, you can kind of fill in the rest without even seeing the numbers. Here we are, present day retirement age is actually a little bit younger than it was then. Does anyone know lifespan now? For those of you that are guessing. 85 is the right number. And so now we have a retirement average of 23 years. 23 years of sitting on the front porch and sitting in a rocking chair and going to dinner at 3:30 in the afternoon. And that, as you all know, is not really a sustainable idea. I don't think anybody really wants to do those kinds of things. Even if you're a big golf lover, 23 years is a long time to do nothing but golf. And so we have this chunk of time that is much different, very much a departure from the spirit that these legislators intended for it to be in 1935. So this is really the root of where we are now, because now as we come to the present day, and as we move on to the next part of our agenda, how can we use that information to define the new retirement mentality? Well, it's really quite simple. It may be a little jarring for you, but we're all conditioned to believe that there is this finish line in the road, that there's a point that we'll eventually make our way up to, and we'll stop, and we'll pull off the road. And then we'll just sit around and sit on the sidelines. But this may be startling. For most people, the finish line doesn't really exist. I mean, it may exist on your Social Security enrollment form, but it doesn't exist in the hearts or in the minds of most people. For most people, they'll get to this point in their lives, And they're not going to stop at all. And in fact, that road that we've been conditioned will end continues. It goes on and on. And the question becomes, how do we navigate it? What do we do as we walk along that road? And there's lots of ways to think about that, but we think that this picture provides all the insight that we need as to what that road means. And I don't know if any of you have had the pleasure of seeing your own children. I'm sure you have if you have your own children or grandchildren do something like learn to walk, take their first steps. And when they do, they almost always have this kind of look of delight on their face. They're absolutely delighted. And an early childhood development expert would say that the reason that they have this kind of expression on their face is because for the first time in their lives, they're making a contribution. They're accomplishing something. And it's such an elemental part of being alive, of being a human, that it never goes away. This becomes something that stays with us for the rest of our lives, and despite how we've been conditioned to think about it, does not go away when we turn 62 and a half, or when we turn 65. And this is the reason that the majority of Americans, that more than 50% of Americans, say that they want work to be some part of their retirement. What they're really saying is not necessarily that they're going to be doing exactly the same thing that they're doing when they're 32 or 45, but what they're saying is they want to continue to make a contribution. They want to have some kind of productive activity that they're engaged in. Said another way, they want to die with their boots on. They have no intention of rolling up the sidewalk and pulling off the road. And so then that takes us to our roles in all of this. What can you, as a financial advisor, do with someone who has this kind of mindset? And we have 3 very specific ideas for you about how you can really connect with them and change the conversation in a relevant way when you're talking with someone who's in that position. And the 3 ways that we recommend that you change the conversation are the 3 questions that almost every retiree has. There are really only 3 when you boil it down to its simplest form. The first one, what's it going to look like? What does it really consist of? Secondly, when is all this going to happen? And then finally, how are we going to pay for it? How much is it going to cost? Those are the 3 basic questions in the end that every retiree has, and that's going to answer much of their concern. So talking about this first one, and this is deceptively complex. It seems like we should know what our retirement's going to look like, but if you talk to most 45-year-old, 55-year-old people, they're not exactly sure. They may have some idea of hobbies that they like to do. They can probably tell you the balance in some of their retirement accounts. Maybe they know how much is in their, their 401k or their employer-sponsored plan, but they don't necessarily really know what it's going to look like. And so we're going to begin with that. And to do that, I'm going to direct you to the cards that you have in your packages, ask you to pull them out. I'm not going to go through all that again. We've got that. Pull them out. Make the selections, get some examples, share them. Move on to the fact cards, the pastel cards. Now I'm going to give you just a couple of minutes to choose the 2 concerns that you're most personally concerned about. I'm going to stop the exercise. I'm going to bring your attention back because everyone's energy is waning here, etc., etc. So, of the 2 kinds of cards, picture cards or the word cards, where do we have the most energy in the room? It's only the picture cards, right? Absolutely. And the word cards are important. We get paid to help people mitigate the risk, to deal with the issues that are on those pastel colored words. We would be remiss if we didn't do that. But we would also be remiss if we skip those picture cards, and that is frankly what the industry trains us to do. The industry trains us to spend all of our time talking about the inflation and the stock market crash that might be around the corner, and doesn't give us any support or conditioning at all to talk to people about what really is going to motivate them and get them excited, which is the picture part. And that leads us to principle number 1. Principle number 1 that underlies these tools is this, plain and simple. If you can see it, if your clients can see it and feel it, they're going to be likely to commit to it. That is principle number 1. If you can see it and feel it, you'll commit to it. Now this is a basic idea that any coach knows, any coach that, say, is working with someone who has a new goal, someone who's a runner, is going to help them do one thing